Welcome to Movies That Matter, the podcast about recent films going above and beyond the call of box office returns to boldly explore a social issue affecting people's lives. I'm Nicole Finari.
And I'm Jen Brown.
And what movie are we overanalyzing this week?
The Invisible Man.
So when Cecilia's, played by Elizabeth Moss, abusive ex takes his own life and leaves her his fortune, she suspects his death was a hoax. As a series of coincidences turn lethal, Cecilia works to prove that she is being hunted by somebody no one can see. All right. What did we think of The Invisible Man?
You know, I liked it. It was much more intense and scary than I thought it would be. I think I was thinking of a bit more of sort of like a Lifetime-esque type of Enough or, you know, something along those lines.
Sure.
But I think Elizabeth Moss's performance really made a huge difference. And it was legit, like I'm a scaredy cat, I'll admit that, but it was legit scary. It was good. It's like suspenseful. Like the third act, it kind of fell apart.
Yeah. It dragged a little bit.
But I thought that they did a good job, like building the tension and, you know, even as it was a little predictable, it's still, like I still had some scares and felt, you know, yeah.
Yeah.
I'd give it a thumbs up.
I agree. I mean, the opening sequence with her,
the
like,
opening
escaping.
sequence is so good.
And you're like, there isn't a movie if she doesn't get out of this house. But, like, You're still really, like...
I didn't think she was going to get out of the house.
On edge.
Yeah.
And also, like, so after we had done The Quiet Place, like, I was thinking to myself, like, how long would I survive in this world? And, like, I calculated about 9 minutes, because from me having that thought and to me knocking over something in my bathroom.
Yeah, no.
It was about 9 minutes.
It's pretty good. Like,
so when she's just, like, accidentally, like, kicking the bowl, and I'm like, I just was like, oh God, I would do all of those things. Like, so she's like trying to escape the house and she's like tripping over stuff and whatever. And I'm like, oh, so realistic.
Yeah, no, it's a very effective opening because it's really quiet. Like as she's trying to escape the house, it's just very intense. And like, you don't even really need, like, cause you know, even if you haven't read a summary of the movie or what have you, you already know pretty much right away, like from the moment it opens, what's happening, right? Like she's trying to slip out of the bed quietly and she's tiptoeing around. And like, I just found that scene, like it was very effective.
I agree.
And very scary. Really
scary. And I think it did a really good job. And we're obviously more into this later, but I think, you know, as we're sort of both women, I think it did a really good job on playing on our sort of natural fear.
Right. That sense
the feeling of
physical
anxiety.
Vulnerability. For sure.
Where you're like, you're out with a guy and you kind of just like don't know if the switch is going to flip and something is going to you know what I mean?
No,
like,
for sure.
We just,
just how vulnerable you are.
Yeah.
And I think part of that was just because Elizabeth Moss was so good.
She killed it.
But I also just think, the way it was shot and it was like, and the part where she gets into the car and like, I saw it with my partner and we were both like, go, just get out of there. And like but no, I felt very vulnerable.
Yeah, I did too. And there were so many things that, okay. So one thing I wish, I felt like the camera angles, I would have liked a tighter sort of rule on perspective. So I felt like there were times when the camera was like implying that he was there and that you were like, the audience, were observing him. And there were times when it felt like you were supposed to be him, like his perspective of watching her, and it would kind of flip, and I was like, since he's actually not there and it's invisible, it would be a little easier for me to like mentally understand if you kept that more consistent. But I mean, like I've always said, like the most effective horror is like what you don't see, like having him be invisible. And I thought any of the scenes, you know, this has been done.
Yes.
Many.
On multiple levels. Multiple tropes here that are well worn.
And I thought they really stayed out of the territory of gimmicks and really just didn't fall into some like really dumb footprint traps,
right?
And the struggles, the fight scenes, I thought were really good and just they didn't look, again, gimmicky or stupid.
Right.
They were fighting an invisible foe now,
right? Like, yeah, like I think it did like once it got to the part where it was like, okay, like this. It is a being. Like, I thought that was, like, so there's initial fight scene where he attacks her in the, in the kitchen. And they have this whole, like, out and out fight where she's, fending off this invisible being. But I thought that what was even more effective was the scene where she's talking to her friend's daughter who's trying to cheer her up after she's had a rough time. And she says, you know what, like and this is the friend whose house that she's staying at. And so he's his teenage daughter. So she's having a conversation with this teenager who's saying, oh, like, let's order pizza or what have you. Let's have a good night together. And we'll sort of forget about everything. And then just abruptly, the invisible being hits her. And that actually, because it caught me totally off guard. Like, I guess I could have seen that coming, but it caught me totally off guard. And it was just jarring. Like, just seeing her get hit like that.
That was excellent. And the sister in the restaurant.
That was, yeah.
So, to me, it was so well done because they literally did it so fast.
Right.
By the time you register that the movie... So, the... Spoiler alert, as always.
There's a lot of spoilers here. Sorry.
So... By the time you see the knife move on its own, and you like your brain is like, it's over.
Yeah,
he slit her throat. Like, you're done.
Yeah, it's like I saw it out of the corner of my eye.
Exactly.
It's sort of hovering, and then
it's done.
It was done.
And I thought making it go that quickly, where you just almost don't have time to register it, just like all of a sudden, like you hear the smack and you see her freak out, and you're like, what the? Like, it's so disorienting and upsetting.
It was very upsetting.
Like, well done.
And especially because she wanted to meet up with her sister to talk about what was going on. She chose a public place, a crowded restaurant.
Yeah.
And then it does not work out quite the way that it should. But it was like she did everything right. And still,
Yep.
So no, that scene was, and I will say just in general, like thinking back to those tropes, and I think part of why this movie worked for me is that usually, and I'm thinking of the sort of like abused woman, finds empowerment and ends up, getting back at her abuser. And it followed some of those familiar beats, where it's, abused woman fights back. Which has a lot of problems, obviously. But I think one thing that like I appreciated about it was that it sort of dwelled a lot more just like on her trauma, than like I think a lot of these other films do. Like we spend a lot more time just sort of like realizing how deeply traumatized and how deeply damaged and how horrific the abuse that she suffered was. And because we didn't have a lot of the film that took place during the time when she was with him, because the film opens with her escaping from him. So it was more just like Elizabeth Moss's acting and just like how haunted and how, affected she was that really carried that. And I thought it was really powerful.
I agree. And actually what I thought was a very interesting and good choice in the movie to that point is like, first of all, other than when, and it turns out not to be him at all anyway, like you never see him touch her.
Right.
There are no flashback scenes.
Right, exactly.
Of violence. You never witness any, other than him punching through the car window when she leaves.
Right.
And she never talks about it.
No,
and
she alludes to it.
I loved that.
Yeah.
I actually loved that, they represent that the sister and the friend, first of all, had no idea this was going on, that she hadn't told them. So it's coming as a complete surprise. And then, there are a couple times when people are like, do you want to talk? And she's like, no.
No.
And I was like, that's really refreshing. Like,
I mean, she
you
said,
just stayed out of the whole sort of torture porn aspect of like putting a woman at the center of the film and then sort of, you know, I don't want to say glorifying is not the right word, but like reveling in
her
suffering.
Yeah.
And I thought that was unlike every other movie you've named. I thought that was
like she does suffer for sure, but you know,
but the suffering is mental and emotional, and her like inability to even leave the house.
Right. Like I think, like I appreciated that it was like the impact of this on her versus just watching her get punched in the face repeatedly.
100%. The movie was more focused on the mental scars that were, and the emotional scars sort of left behind.
And because Elizabeth Moss is so good,
right?
She did a fantastic job portraying all that.
And I will also say, just on sort of like the technical stuff, everybody in the movie was good, and I thought they did a good job with music that was subtle. It was menacing when it needed to be, but it just like didn't take over.
No, it was done very well.
It was, I really appreciated the score, and it was like, again, there to heighten the mood, not to create it.
And just the fact that it let the movie, like, they allowed the movie to be quiet at times when, like, and it was really effective. So I would say the main times when I noticed that was the opening sequence, which is very quiet for the most part. Like, because she's sneaking away, and I think it heightens your sense of just how tense the situation is. And like when she does make a noise, like when she sets off, you know, the car alarm, it is jarring because you feel like you're in it. And like the other scene I would say it was really effective was there's a scene where she's sleeping at the friend's house, and her and the friend's daughter, like she's sleeping in the daughter's bedroom, and they're both asleep, and he pulls the cover off. And is just lingering over them. And that's another one where you're seeing it from the perspective of the invisible man. Yeah, the invisible man. But I think it's very effective in the sense of like, they're so vulnerable, like they're sleeping and they have no idea that he's there. And like, he's clearly, taking pictures, and it's just so creepy and it's so quiet, and it really freaked me out. Like, I was wearing a hoodie sweatshirt when I was watching this, and I pondered like pulling my hood over my head and like pulling the strings down so I couldn't see, because I'm a huge scaredy cat.
Yeah, I like saw it I took the 11:30 a.m. showing, so it would be bright light out when I came out. Yeah. So there were like a couple of there is one other thing that I wanted to bring up. That I really, really liked about the movie. And I do want to sort of get into the ending with you and how you felt about it.
Yeah.
But I was so freaking relieved. I was like so incredibly happy that the last like shot of the film wasn't her in a bright sunny park with her like little kid. Because that has been done so many times.
Right.
And they, they sort of, so there's a thing in the movie which I thought actually, again, was really good and unfortunately extremely realistic, where you find out that he's sabotaged her birth control.
Right.
And she realizes that she's pregnant, and you don't know whether she's going to keep it or not. And you don't ever find out, which is great. Right, and I was like really glad that like I could just believe that she made a different choice. Like I was like I was just so happy it didn't end with her and a kid. That would have just made me so angry.
Right. Like it ended with this sort of like femme fatale like shot where she's got like the bright red lipstick and the black outfit, and which is, like I said, it's following certain beats of a story in which, you have this revenge. And I would say it's a fantasy, really. Like, it's a revenge fantasy because it's not the reality of, what most women go through in domestic violence situations. And so the idea that you would be able to get the upper hand and get revenge and kill your abuser, that does not and also just walk away scot-free. That usually does not tend to happen. So I think in a sense, like, having her walk away with, like, the red, it still to me felt like a fantasy, you know, a sort of fantasy, like, sequence. But I still, you know, because obviously I keep watching these movies, so I, to some extent, appreciate it and I get it.
So there were a couple things that, for me, yeah, I mean, it's definitely the fantasy, and I want to talk about how effectively they may or may not have worked up to it. One of the things that I found interesting, though, again, thinking back to the past of the revenge, is, like, it's the woman in the movie, like, always has her champion.
Right, of course, yes.
And in this movie, like, I don't think that was clear. Like, I think she comes out and he's, like, not pleased with how she handled this situation.
Right, because he's a cop and he's honorable and a good guy. And
he decides to let it go. But again, I thought that was different. It wasn't
I don't have any problem with these. Like, I'm just saying that, like, it's following a certain...
I think that, to me, that beat was different. That beat was different. The beat where he looks at her and is like, did you just, like, cold blood kill this guy?
Yeah.
And she's like, I sure did.
More or less.
And he's not like, rah, rah, girl power.
Yeah.
Like, he's actually like, I don't know if I'm okay with that. And I thought that was such an interest. I thought that was different. And I thought that was a different beat where you as the audience are then I'm sitting there thinking, like, wow, was it okay? Like, was it okay what she did? Like,
right.
So that, to me, like, the whole lead up and how it's done, to me, is still, yes, the beat of the revenge fantasy, but I think the audience perspective on it is a little bit less black and white. Yeah, it's a little bit more gray that she just kills him.
I mean, I think in any of these, it's, you know, it is portrayed as my only, right, like, all of the sort of social services and things that are supposed to help me, right, like going to the police, being able to go to friends and family, like, I've been isolated, I'm not going to be able to be safe at a shelter, like, all of those things have sort of proven to not be effective. And so then they're backed into this corner where the only choice that they're left with is to take him out. And I think that that's, you know... So yeah, I don't say it as like this is a bad thing. I just think it's like a sort of, it is a, you know, we've seen this story before, like in Hollywood films.
We have.
And I do, and like I said, I like the way that, like, they sort of treated certain parts of the story. I think they, one thing they did I thought was different. Like we talked about, we didn't see him hit her. We didn't have flashbacks of that. We didn't have the whole... We know a little bit of how their relationship got started because she talks about, you know, meeting him at a party or what have you. But they don't really spend a lot of time on that. And, like, I think what really comes through is, like, the psychological abuse, the control, the, like, you know, she says, like, oh, you know, if I, like, I think at one point he said, and did he, when she's talking to her sister and the friend about the abuse she suffered, he says, oh, and would he hit you then? And she said, you know, if I was lucky. And she just says it with this, like, haunted sort of, and you get the idea that, like, it's not just hitting. It's the total and utter control. Like,
I think she actually says among
other things. You're right. He says among other things. And it's just the total control that he had over her. And just, like, he totally broken her down. She was terrified. And I just thought that it did a better job of, like, sort of illustrating just how traumatic and horrific that would be, versus some of other, like, the Lifetime movies and the other things where they kind of skip over that sequence from, like, I've gotten
like, totally
away.
Empowered.
The whole processing part is just, like, you know, a montage. Yeah. And then we're off to getting our revenge. And I appreciate this movie really set with, like, how haunted she was by all of this and just how, like, messed up that would be, you know?
I did too, and I think, and there's been some really annoying backlash on Twitter.
I've not.
So that someone posted on Twitter, like, every time there's a movie with a female lead, some male critic has to point out how it was problematic that she didn't give him a boner.
What?
Yeah.
I don't even understand what that means.
No, I saw some of those tweets of, like, I literally saw a guy tweet, like, she's not pretty enough to, like,
oh my God,
kick in my protective instinct. I only want to protect beautiful women. Like, casting her was a stupid choice. But I do think on the flip side of that, casting her was a very great and a very intentional choice. Mm-hmm. She's not J-Lo.
Right.
She's not.
She's not Julia Roberts.
She's relatively ordinary looking.
Yeah.
Even, you know, like, not even by Hollywood standards, like by our regular standards. Plus, like, one of the things that I noticed in this movie, and I wondered, I was like, I don't know if this is makeup or not. If it was makeup, it was absolutely freaking brilliantly done. It appears that she's not wearing any makeup this entire movie.
Yeah.
Like, her skin is not that nice.
Yeah.
And it's blotchy when she cries. Like, she's really not made up.
Yeah. No.
Or she's made up to look
right.
I'm not sure. I kind of wish I knew. And so, like, you really have... And she has a line. She's like, why me? Like, you're rich and successful.
Yes, I was just thinking
you could have picked anybody. And I really...
And you could have just left me alone, right? Like, you could have just moved on to someone else.
And it's like, no matter how many times feminists say rape is about power.
Right.
Not sex.
Right.
It never, you know, seems to, like, penetrate.
No, you're absolutely right.
A terrible, unintentional pun. Sorry, guys. And so I think having her be an every woman, that it can happen to any of us, I thought was... Plus, she's a great actress. Like, it was one of my favorite choices that the movie made, was just her casting in general. Yeah. And keeping her. I mean, she's wearing schlubby clothes. Like, this is and even when she's glammed up, I mean, she's kind of still Elizabeth Moss. Like,
yeah. But I think you're really in, like, that point about just, like, this is about power. And, like, even just the whole, like, him being invisible. And just, like, how long he almost just, like, relished in being there in them not knowing. And that's a form of control, and that's a form of psychological torture. And I think it was very effective. And, like, we don't have a bunch of, like, like, bruises that are, you know, like, a bunch of makeup, like, heavy makeup bruises and things like that. It's not that type of torture. And I think that was very effective.
Yeah, I mean,
in illustrating that, like, the control, the psychological terror.
The financial issues, right? Like,
also control
of her money. You know, it's a bit obvious, but another thing that I appreciate, like, you know, she has her go bag and you can see, like, her social security card. Like, because that, like, hiding your relevant documents is a way that abusers get you to stay. And especially in terms of, like, I mean, in a non-domestic abuse situation, like a sex trafficking, like stealing your passport or your green card, you know, like holding important documents is like straight out of the abusive playbook.
Right. Absolutely.
And making sure you can't leave. So I really felt like they handled it with the right amount of sensitivity.
Yeah. And like handling all of the different levels and the different ways that this plays out, you know, in terms of the control.
Yeah.
Like in terms of like the physical control of the house, all the alarms, the psychological,
cameras,
like all of it. And I thought they did a really good job with that.
I think though, I was, you know, kind of, and this is going to come into my recommendations. I said it before, like I have been all Me Too'd. I have gone down this rabbit hole. I've been reading She Said, and I was thinking, like, coming into this podcast, like, so Me Too has mostly been about sexual harassment. Johnny Depp still getting parts. We really haven't. address domestic violence
right. And I think
in this country.
And I think that sort of touches on, in some ways, what's a problem with like this whole sort of genre of the abused woman in this movie as well, is that you don't ever get a sense of like who the husband was beyond just monster, right? And when you have the husband out to be just this monster, then it makes it much more difficult for people to say, oh, well, like that guy couldn't be an abuser. Right. He's a great friend. Oh, that guy couldn't be an abuser. Like, he's a wonderful father. And I think that like not having that nuance and having it play out in this way, I think is a detriment in some ways. And like, I think we're going to have to deal a bit more with the complicated nature of people and people who abuse.
I agree. And I think that I'm not sure what the block is. Like, I'm not sure why we still cannot reckon with domestic violence. But I do think, like, on the Me Too side, like, the point of Me Too, one of the things was to sort of normalize it, right? The hashtag was like, tell us all of your stories because there are loads, right?
Right.
But part of it was like, and there was another hashtag, and I'm blanking on it. Oh, like why I didn't report.
Right.
And I think that this movie, like you said, it gets into that dangerous territory, which is like victim blaming. And I think when you see the
I didn't see any victim blaming here.
It didn't.
I mean,
they don't. They don't. The movie doesn't victim blame, but set aside from like, oh, so when you experience domestic violence, what you're supposed to do is become this empowered person, right. And if you don't figure out how to get revenge.
Right, and if you don't, then you deserve it.
Right, that's what I mean. Like,
yeah,
what
the flip side of
this. Like what is the systemic message that these types of movies are sending?
You to get empowered and to
to get yourself out of these situations. And tough luck if you don't have a sister who can come pick you up at 4 a.m.
Right. Or a martial arts trainer to help you know,
Yeah. And you're not Julia Roberts. You can have like a man just come into your life and protect you. So I think we have, especially kind of based on the verdict of, you know, what happened with Harvey Weinstein, we've come a long way in understanding
absolutely
how victims of sexual abuse actually respond.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that there is just a deep part of our culture that is still not willing to give that nuance and benefit of the doubt to women who stay with men who abuse them.
Absolutely. And like, I will even say for myself, like, it was hard to just keep watching her get like dumped on. Like, it was difficult to watch, like just watching, you know, when she got basically like when the friend thought that he hit his daughter and they said, we're done with you. The sister, so one of the things he does also in that control area is he writes a fake letter, fake email to her sister, so the sister's done. And just like watching just like all of that play out, it's hard to watch. It's hard to just watch someone suffer. And like I found myself, a part of myself thinking like, okay, like I know how these, and I think that's part of the appeal of these stories, right?
Right.
Is that they do move to this other sort of part where then they get their revenge and everything is okay. And like, we know that's not how it works. And I think like what you're sort of describing is that, like we do just have to get more comfortable with the idea that like, this is just happening. Like the movie could have just, you know, if the movie just ended on that note, you know, what would we have come away with?
I mean,
so it's just this tough, like, we want resolution. And a lot of times there's not resolution.
I mean, a lot of time the resolution is he succeeds in killing her.
Right.
I mean, and that's one of those things too. Like,
And I don't want to watch that. I want to watch
no,
my
no, I
revenge
certainly,
fantasy.
no, I certainly don't.
But like that, but what the reality is that, yeah.
I mean, that is the reality. And I think that they tried to be a little bit more negative on the cops and what they were capable and willing to do for her. But I think there could have been more pointed criticism
for sure.
on law enforcement and how ineffective they are. I mean, and, you know, and I just, like I said, I you know, like I sit here and I think like, what is going to be our Me Too? Like, what is the moment when we, like, what is the watershed where we start to take this seriously? And I don't know what.
How do we tell this story in such a way where it's almost like, oh, it's a, you know, humanity is like this zero-sum game where it's like if we portray the woman as a full person with all of these different layers, then we have to portray the man as like this, you know, monster we're not going to give. And I feel like there has to be a story that like really delves deeply into all of that. Yeah, he's just this absolute monster. And I just want to see more of like, what is it that sort of like, what is the, I want something that delves into like, what is the calculus that sort of comes into play for someone who sees themselves as like this strong, independent person. And then, you know what I mean? Like, what are all of the sort of dynamics at play there?
Right.
And I just think it's this, you know.
And I think it's tough. So like when you enter the story in medias res as well, because it doesn't work like that. He doesn't just hit you on your second date.
Right.
Like,
and I feel like if you had a story that spent a bunch of time on the husband, I would be like, why are we watching him? And so it's this tough, I just feel like it's a really tough thing to do, you know? Like,
and I think, and then again, from my own personal experience of having like an emotionally abusive advisor in grad school, like it was well after the fact that I realized like we were literally in the textbook cycle of abuse where every fifth time we met, he loved my work. It was amazing. And I could do no wrong. And I kept being like, if I just do this perfectly, if I just do the right thing, it's going to be one of those meetings and not one where he tells me I'm the worst student he ever had. And like after it, I was like, oh, that is how you get sucked in.
Right, exactly.
Because they don't do, it's like the unmitigated monster. They don't show you how much you get built up when they are nice to you.
Exactly.
And they're, you know, I guess I haven't been in a domestic violence situation where they just like tell you their best and are super romantic on how much they love you and how good it feels when they do love you. And that you just are like, if I just do A, B, but not C, and then D and E, not D, E, like then, you know, he's going to be great. And I'm going to get back to that. And Yeah.
Like, I want something that, like, just gets in your head. Like, you know what I mean? That, like, is able to just, like, truly capture the fullness of that experience, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like, all of it.
Yeah, and then I'll be like, I'm not watching that movie.
Exactly.
That's the problem. I don't think I can sit through it.
Right.
Like, yeah, I mean, it was like Whiplash was, like, extremely like triggering for me in that whole grad school experience.
Like that's been on television a lot lately, and I've been thinking about it.
And I loved it, and it was brilliant, but it was like, oh, it just brought it all back. Like, so yeah, and I just think hopefully our time of reckoning is coming, but we're not there yet. And I love the fantasy, and I don't want to take away from anybody who has been in these situations, and the fantasy is a lifeline and a buoy for them. But I am concerned that it perpetuates a myth that, like, again, that this is not systemic, and then the woman just has to figure out a way to, you know, pull herself up by her bootstraps and get revenge and be okay.
Just put on an invisible suit and cut his throat, ladies, and all will be well. Like, that is not... Yeah. And I will say, like, I think that we have progressed in terms of like how we think about these issues. And I think for, you know, as we're saying, oh, like I don't want to see another, you know, another portrayal of a woman being hit. And it's like there was a point where that was a huge deal, right? Like I took a class in college on domestic violence, and it was like a lot of it dealt with like portrayals in film and television. And one of the first things we watched was a made-for-TV movie called The Burning Bed. And it was, I think it was in the 70s or maybe the 80s. But the idea is that, you know, it's a woman being abused, and, you know, it is, as described, she ends up burning him in his bed. It's, you know, but it's a whole, but it was one of those things where that hadn't really been portrayed on TV before. The idea that, you know, that like this is something that happens, like that women are, that domestic violence is a thing that exists, right?
Well, it like wasn't illegal until like the 70s.
Right. And like a lot of people, you know, maybe they were aware of it. Maybe they had a relative or someone from their church or something where they knew that there was a situation, but they didn't, you know, having it out in the open like that, having the, you know, was a big deal. And so I think that like we're still progressing in terms of, you know, like the sort of PSA aspect of this, right? Like abuse happens and like this is a real thing. And getting to all of these sort of nuanced points of like, how do we respond to it as a society, and how do we support people? What leads to it, and all of these different things. So I think this movie is like, to me, I see it as like part of like that evolution of like, how do you portray these things in film and television, and sort of, you know, what does that lead to?
Yeah. But I do want to say it happens in somewhat lower numbers, but still absolutely happens to men. And they are, of course, because of gender stereotypes, far less likely to report.
Right.
And it's just as bad when a man gets hit or is emotionally abused or financially abused as when a woman does. And this movie is about a woman getting abused. I don't want to restrict the conversation. I hope that should we start to evolve on domestic violence, like by all means, like men who are abused, come along and be freed and erase your stigma of admitting that it's been going on as well.
Absolutely. And I would say for that reason, I'm glad that you brought up Whiplash, because that is a tale of a man being abused, like that really emotionally abused. Like, but I will say at the same time, I think that domestic violence is a systemic issue that impacts women primarily, and that stems from the fact that, like, you know, going back to like women not being able to own property and it being permissible and legal for you to rape your wife.
Right.
And we can't forget that. Does not mean though that men are not also victims of abuse, and that is also, you know, that is unacceptable.
Yeah. So
I just had to throw in the systemic.
Yep. What's left on our list?
I would say the third act in terms of the like going to the hospital, like how it progresses. So I think it got a little hokey in that third act in terms of like the fight. There's like this prolonged fight scene with the guards in the hospital where, you know, they're basically just getting, like, I don't know why that was all in there. I thought it was a little bit kind of silly, like compared to like the first half of the movie, which I thought was like, did a great job of like building up the tension and sort of like keeping it tightly focused on this, you know, on the situation. It was like having this like hospital fight scene was just a little bit, that didn't work for me. It's one of the things that didn't work for me.
I wasn't sure. I mean, I think that was just like a little bit of like pandering, like this is a horror movie, let's have a lot of like fights and people getting hurt. But I also thought, and I thought this was an interesting tack. I don't think it was entirely successful, but I'm sort of not sorry that they tried it, which was like all of that stuff seemed really like out of left field. And then you realize like it was supposed to be out of left field because it wasn't him.
Well, which part wasn't him though, right?
Well, I thought all the hospital stuff was the brother.
Right, was the brother.
Right. So you're sort of like, and her and the brother have these conversations about like, you know, he was like, I was his victim,
right,
before you were. And I think they were trying to say like abusers don't come out of nowhere.
Right. He's a pattern of this.
Yeah.
He's a control freak. He's,
don't think that was very successful, and the brother's motives just seemed...
It didn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, and
it was like, how did he get the brother to do that, and why did the brother agree to wear the suit and go to the hospital? And then it was also like, does the invisible suit make them stronger? Like, what is,
how exactly
does this suit work?
Yeah, no, it seemed a little bit bulletproof there for a second.
Yeah, bulletproof, and it also like would flash on and off, like, because like she damages the suit, and so then it like kind of like starts to like spark on and off so you can see him. But then it was just sort of like, okay, so it just was very hokey in terms of the timing of when the suit would like show up and when it wouldn't. And it just did, and it was sort of like, they just have to sort of tie this off somehow, and they don't know how, so we're just sort of running around in the hospital.
I mean, I think the intention was to show how she gains the strength to do what she does at the end. Right. So she's...
And the last thing I would want to highlight is I really liked the young actress who played the friend's daughter. Like the one who was going to college.
Yeah. Well, she wasn't in
I've seen her in something before.
Definitely seen her in something before.
I thought she was very good, and I really liked her. I think it was Storm Reed. Oh, it's the girl from Wrinkle in Time.
Wrinkle in Time. Yes, okay, which Storm we ironically did together. Yeah. Okay. All right, so tying it all together for a social impact score between 1 to 10. You go first because I don't know.
Okay, so I'm going to give it a 8.
Wow.
Is that a high one?
That's a high one.
So I'm giving it an 8. I would say largely on the strength of Elizabeth Moss's performance as an abused woman, because I just thought she was fantastic. And I thought that she just captured so much of just like the trauma and the, and the resolve and just like all of these different emotions, terror. And I just thought she was fantastic. And so for that reason mainly. Okay.
Yeah, I think like all the points I want to give it, I then want to take away for other things. Yeah, so like I'm sort of like in the 5-6 territory because like I said, I just worry that at the end of the day, this revenge fantasy is doing more harm than good.
Right. No, I think that's fair.
And I don't know the answer to that, and I haven't seen any media studies on this, so I'm not sure. And I think that we need to really think about where we are sending the wrong signals to people about how they need to, again, blaming an individual for a systemic problem.
Right. And and I will say, I think that there are definitely clear limitations to like this sort of genre and this type of film. But I do feel strongly about Elizabeth Moss's performance.
I agree.
And I also appreciate that it's a sort of horror movie that doesn't totally hinge on just like watching a woman get beat up.
Agreed. 100%.
And just as a movie that is sort of focused on domestic violence, and talking about the control aspect and the, the sort of psychological aspect of it, I appreciated that.
All right. So recommendations.
Oh, I mean, I have so many, obviously. I think that this is just a very rich area of just film, and sort of like as a person who likes a strong female lead, I think you should watch The Burning Bed, and you should watch Enough, and you should watch Sleeping with the Enemy and Thelma and Louise, and just like all of these different movies sort of about how women deal with abuse. Oh, What's Love Got to Do with It? Is another great one. So I have multiple recommendations.
There you go. My recommendation for the week, again, like I've just been very immersed. So I just found out that while I'm reading She Said, Ronan Farrow has a podcast out about his book, Couch and Kill. I was talking to a friend who actually read the book, and she was like, it sounds like it is actually kind of different from She Said. It's the same story, though. But I really enjoyed the podcast, and you get to hear, like, the voices of some of the people who were involved in the story. All right, well, we hope you enjoyed this episode of Movies That Matter. You know how to get in touch with us. We're on Twitter at Movies Matter Pod. We're on Facebook at Movies Matter Pod. Our email address is at moviesmatterpod@gmail.com. Our website is the whole long name, moviesthatmatterpodcast.com. We love hearing your comments, even sometimes your criticisms. So reach out, get in touch, tell your friends about us, and remember, movies matter.
And so do you.
See you next time.